Chapter 19, Ecology. The topic that we need to discuss today is succession. And succession is very significant, and it is just a predictable, gradual change of a biotic community over time, as you can see in this diagram right here, starting out maybe with a grassland and finally ending up with an oak hickory forest. Now, to begin this discussion, there is actually two different ways that these ecosystems can develop gradually. One is to start from bare rock, and we call that primary succession. So in other words, this is starting really from scratch. And this would often occur after a volcanic eruption has occurred, and there's no plants or any animals in that area, and we start from scratch. The secondary succession is the kind that probably happens most often, and this is where you already have a soil present and maybe some plants, and they go through a change. This could be like an old field that somebody's been farming, and then it's no longer farmed, and over time it will eventually return to a forest. This also happens when you have a forest fire that burns all the vegetation in an area, and it kind of has to start from scratch. So in this process of succession, we have what we call the pioneer organisms. Those would be the first plants and animals that are in an area. Like for instance, might have insects would be like grasshoppers, um, open area birds like the meadowlark or the grasshopper sparrow. The animals that you would find would be like a field mouse or something like that. Uh, and then the next stage, as you can see in the diagram, we would have the grass eventually changing over to shrub, where it'd be kind of a mixture of the two, and then finally into shrub. And that maybe happens around 10 to 15 years in. This period will start. And the animal population is also going to change. Plants or rabbits are going to be among the most noticeable animals. You might find cardinals and field sparrows are going to be probably the predominant kind of bird that you will find at that time. Maybe about 25 to 30 years into this succession, you're going to start to see pine trees beginning to establish themselves, and they're going to begin to shade out the shrubs. So we're going to have a whole new understory. Those are plants that grow in the shade that are going to come about, and they're going to change the animal population as well because the environment or habitat is changing. Um, Squirrels, raccoons, pine warblers will thrive in a pine forest. And then after about 50 years, um, hardwood deciduous forests are going to begin to establish themselves. And those would be like the oak trees and hickories. Um, and they're growing in the understory, that's in the shade of the pine forest. But eventually they're going to grow to the point where they'll shade out the pine trees as well. And so in many areas of North Carolina, as in many areas of the eastern United States, the hardwood deciduous forest is called their climax vegetation. And here the area is free of disturbance from natural disasters. It'll stay like this for long periods of time. And like natural disasters, I would say if there was no fire or flood, or man hasn't come in and cut down the trees for lumber, he's not clearing the land for farming, but just leaves it like that. And so we'll call this a climax vegetation, and this is self-perpetuating, which means it will continue like this for long periods of time. If any of the species die, they're just replaced by plants of the same species. So what is man's place in his environment? Well, one of the more prevalent views that we hear more about today is called deep ecology. It's not based upon the Bible. It's actually based on a humanistic view of our Earth, and it emphasizes 2 points: that all life is of equal value, and that is every species has an inherent right to life, no matter how small its role is in the ecosystem. And then all life forms are interdependent on each other. And this is a holistic view. Holistic means they just see the whole thing as a whole working together. And it just views man as just another species that's part of the living earth. And man is not separate from it. It doesn't have any special rights over any other species. And you will sometimes see legislation that uh, where they will protect a certain species even at the detriment of mankind. So one of the things that they accuse this group accuses of Christians is that the reason why the earth is in the state that it is because of man's uh, view of the earth and the mistreatment. And that is true. Some Christians do mistreat the environment. Uh, these Christians believe that the environment doesn't matter because the earth is going to be destroyed in the end anyway, so let's just use it and abuse it. Uh, Now, this is the wrong attitude because God has given us the present responsibility of taking care of the earth. In Genesis 2:15, we find that responsibility given to us. So man's authority to manage the world does not give him a license to misuse or abuse it. So we need to combat that extreme of use it however you want, and remember that the world belongs to God. In Genesis 2:15 that was mentioned earlier, and the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. In Psalms 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and the world and they that dwell therein. So it's clear from here that the world belongs to God. Uh, Now, God's designed man to have dominion, and not in a mindless exploitation of it, but to be a caretaker of it. So if we look in the Bible, we see in different places how God views uh, living things and what's man's responsibility to them. In Deuteronomy 22:6 and 7, when Moses was restating the law, one of the instructions that they were was being given to the children of Israel is that they were told that if they came upon a nesting bird, that they could take the young but not the mother. Uh, and the thought here, as we understand more about it, is the young is still immature, may not survive to adulthood, but the mother already is an adult and she can lay more eggs uh, and continue the species, and there would be still food in the future for man to eat. Proverbs 12:10 says, "A righteous man regards the life of his beast." One of the things that people who would use horses and oxen uh, for plowing and doing farm work know that you have to care for your beast. You have to give it food at the proper time and the proper amounts. You have to give it rest periods. You can't just farm all day, but you have to give it rest periods in between. But uh, Proverbs 12:10 says that a wicked man will be cruel to his animal and abuse it, and um, those that had animals like that know that if you abuse an animal long enough, it will uh, become sickly and eventually die. So we need to combat the extremes. Uh, one extreme is abusing it. The other extreme is leaving the earth as its natural state as possible. In other words, don't touch it. Uh, don't look like you've ever been there. And that isn't a bad thing if we have no use for, if we're not using that. Uh, we have, parks for that reason, to leave it in its natural state as possible, because we have no need for it. Uh, Now the question comes up, is all life of equal value? Because that's one of the main tenets of the uh, deep ecology. But what does the Bible have to say about that? Well, in Genesis 1:26 and 27, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So man has a special role. We're made in God's image, and we're to have dominion over all of the living things, and the earth itself. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So after combating the extremes, leaving the earth in its natural state, or abusing it and abusing it, we also know that in Matthew 10:29 and 31, man has a superior role in all of this. Are not two sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father? But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, you are more of value than many sparrows. So you can see that uh, maybe all other living things have an equal right here on earth, but man has a special position in God's eyes. So what's a balanced approach? Well, taking the creation mandate and managing the earth properly, having dominion, and taking care of it, as we saw in Genesis 1:26 and 28, where we subdue and have dominion. Uh, our role is stewardship. And a steward is one who works to preserve and improve his charge for the owner, which means if you are given the responsibility to manage somebody's property, you're trying to preserve it in the best state possible, maybe even improving it so that it's even better than it was when you received it. So man's charge on the earth uh, is to take care of it, but he is only a steward. He's not the owner, so God has the ultimate say. So where does man fit in all of this? Uh, well, man's niche is twofold. He's a consumer and he is a manager. Man is a consumer because he takes material from the food chain, um, but if he's wanting to do this over a long period of time, he needs to uh, manage the earth in such a way that it will continue to self-sustain itself, uh, that it'll keep producing what man needs to live, and all living things need to live for that matter. So man is a manager. The creation mandate says that, and our goal is to strive for wise use. And this is where we sometimes run into trouble because we don't always know what is the wise thing to do. When we look at the population of the earth, um, you can see that it's only been within the last few hundred years that man's population even reached 1 billion, and now we are over 7 billion in population. It's drastically increasing. So what's man's wise use? How is he going to feed all these people in a way that uh, doesn't harm the earth, but actually allows the earth to produce its abundance. Now, one of the ways that man has not been as wise as he should be is borne out by what we refer to as invasive species. We have the Burmese python, which is not native to the U.S. but thrives well in in some of the southern states more towards Florida. Uh, we also have brown tree snakes that have been introduced into the U.S. that have escaped probably from somebody's pet. Same thing with the Burmese pythons, escaped into the wilds or just released into the wild, uh, and they are very good at living in that environment, and they can replace the native species, and that's our concern. Um, Here is a kudzu vines that they just take over a whole area. They'll smother the existing plants with their leaves, and they grow very well. So we need to really understand our environment, and when we introduce new species into an area, are we going to harm the environment ultimately, or are we going to benefit it? So that's one of the things that's man's responsibility, is to learn as much about how each living thing fits into its uh, niche and habitat, and then can make wise choices. That's the end of section 5.